Alright, so in the last video we actually looked at lofting out this piece. What I want to do right now is I want to actually shore this up a little bit, make it look a little bit less bulgy, and also see if we can create the base for this as well, the sort of underlying cap. Well, I'm going to right-click on the model and choose Control Vertex. Now, remember, with Control Vertices, the vertex points actually sit off the model, and they sit in a spot corresponding to the hull. And sometimes it can be easiest to find where these vertices are if you actually examine the hull. Now I can see there's actually a row of vertices right here, which are going to be bulging out a little bit. I'm going to go into my orthographic side view, which is going to be a little bit easier to tweak this. And again, right-click on my model and choose Control Vertex. And now I can very easily find this row of vertices along the center. By hitting R for the scale tool, I can scale this in. However, don't be confused here. If you're looking in the side view, don't use the blue side box, which may look like it's scaling it together. It's only going to get it from one side, and you're going to get a sort of elliptical shape. When doing this, you want to make sure you're scaling using the center box. And that will help me flatten this out just a little bit. I can also take these other vertices and move them up and down if need be. See if I can grab this selection here. We'll see what this row does. That'll help me sort of tweak this edge. If I want a harder edge in this transition zone, that could be very nice to use. In fact, I'm going to set that up and then maybe scale all 3 rows of these in just a little bit. Although it looks like I grabbed something too much. And in fact, this upper row looks like it's the bottom piece. So let me go back to Control Vertices, remove that from my selection. And now I can just select this upper part. I'm trying to get a very straight-looking connection through this gap, if I can. And I think we've somewhat achieved that here. But again, if you're having a hard time trying to find where those vertices are, right-click on your model, choose Hull, and you'll be able to see where those vertices are going to be. One of the things that I'm looking at here is that I want to actually try and make sure that the top of my bishop flows outwards, going straight up. This is going to be something that's going to help me in the next section, where we're going to look at producing a revolve and sort of sewing that together. That's going to be a concept referred to as tangency, and we're going to spend a lot of time actually looking at that. Well, here is my model, and what I want to do next is I want to produce a cap for the bottom of this. Now, since this piece isn't actually going to move, since we're not actually deforming this, I'm going to be okay creating a planar cap to the bottom. Now, a planar operation that you'll see in the Surfaces menu set, that's actually not going to be a terribly articulate way of working with this, but it is going to create a very nice cap for us. It's going to be a trimmed shape, and you'll see what we mean by that in just a few minutes, so keep that in mind. To create a planar trim shape, let's take the curve that we used for the bottom circle and use that for our operation. We can get this curve back from our construction curves group, or just to demonstrate a new technique of gaining curves, I'm actually going to create the curve based on the NURBS shape. It's kind of a two-way street. We can create the NURBS geometry from curves, but we can also create the curves from NURBS geometry. To create one of these curves, I'm going to right-click on the model and choose Isoparm. That's going to turn my model a light blue color. By selecting the bottom curve, that'll make it yellow. I now know that I've got just that bottom edge selected. I'm going to go to Edit NURBS, Edit Curves, and I'm going to choose Duplicate Surface Curves, which is going to give me an easily selectable curve along the bottom. And again, I've made a new curve for this section. With that singular curve selected, I'm going to go to Surfaces and choose Planar, and I'll have a cap. Now this is a planar trim shape, meaning that if we look at where the edge flow goes on this, if I select both models, notice that the edges really don't run into each other. That's actually slightly problematic for me. The reason being that I want to make sure that if this was deforming, that I would have a vertex on each side of this gap so that if I deformed one section, that there was something to match. You'll notice because I have history turned on right now that it's not going to work. Let me delete all my history. And you'll see if I pull this up, I'm not really going to have a vertex on the other side to pull up in the same way. The reason for this is actually pretty understandable once I right-click on this trim shape and choose Hull. Let me turn off my grid, and you'll be able to see this a little bit better. The hull for the bottom part is actually a square that has been essentially cookie-cutter trimmed into the circle shape based on the bottom. Now, like I said, that's not very articulate, but it might work for a project like this. I'm actually going to go ahead and do something else just to kind of demonstrate a point that can actually be accomplished. Instead of creating the planar trim shape, I'm going to take this curve and I'm going to duplicate it. Hit R for the scale tool and scale it in. I'm going to now select both curves, the outer curve and then the inner curve. And just like before, I'm going to go to Surfaces and choose Loft. When I hit 3 to generate the full curvature, you'll see that this actually matches up pretty nicely, except I still have an open hole at the bottom. But now notice how my grid flow matches across each one of these sections. And if I wanted to deform this, well, I could very easily take the vertices on both pieces and move them up and down together. Well, again, let me come in, do an edit, delete all by type, history. And I'll show you how to actually tap out this hole at the bottom very quickly as well. First, let me go in the hypergraph, take these two new construction curves, and just add them to my construction curves group. We'll add this lofted piece in just a second. What I want to do is actually create a boundary for the interior edge of this instead of a planar, because a boundary is actually going to contain all of my grid flow instead of just trimming something out. To create the boundary, however, I have to create a couple of different sides for this piece. Now, what I mean by that is I see a top, a right side, a bottom side, and a left side right here that I'm going to establish from separate individual curves. I'll right-click on my base piece and choose isoparm. And I'm going to select 4 isoparms that actually look like dividing lines between my sections. Make sure they're solid yellow, not just dotted lines. With this, I'm going to go to Edit NURBS and choose Detach Surfaces. And hit 3 for each one of these surfaces so they maintain their angular quality. And what I've actually done is I've now cut this base up into 4 separate parts. Again, I'll delete my history to make sure there aren't any problems. And now I'm going to go into isoparm component mode by right-clicking on each one of these 4 pieces, turning them blue. And then I'm going to reselect this inner isoparm, which is going to be a quarter circle for each one, which will give me 4, which eventually look like a complete circle. I will go to Edit Curves and say Duplicate Surface Curve, which again gives me 4 separate curves. And then instead of making a planar out of this, I'm going to choose Boundary and hit 3. And now if we notice what happens, my grid flow is actually going to work very, very nicely with this form. A quick delete all by type history and a movement of these curves into my curves group will let me get started. I can then take each of my pieces, choose Control Vertex from the marking menu, and I'm going to be able to drag a selection over the corners and very quickly scale it out. And we've got a relaxed form which doesn't really show any pinching at the bottom and has a nice structure.